There was a Folgers can on the shelf. Red and yellow. 1 pound. Gary Farrow picked it up because it was heavier than it should have been. Inside, 2 folded papers. One from a bank, one from his father's own hand. Gary had been back on the farm 3 days. He hadn't come home out of duty. He'd come home because Minneapolis had run out on him and there was nowhere else to go. He was 29 years old. His father hadn't asked him to come. He stood in that cold Iowa barn in February 1985 and read what his father had been carrying alone. The first paper was from Farm Credit Services of Ames, dated January 9th, 1985. $312,000 owed. The farm as collateral. All 480 acres. A sale proceeding, scheduled for August 15th. 6 months away. Lyle Farrow had known since January. He had told no one. The second paper was older, worn at the creases. The original loan note, signed October 3rd, 1979. $340,000 borrowed. Buchanan County, Iowa. The full Farrow farm put up against it. Gary stood with both papers in his hands and looked out the barn's east window at 480 acres of frozen black Iowa soil. Land his grandfather had built from 60 acres and a post-war stubbornness. Land his father had leveraged at the peak of the market. Land that was now worth less than half what the note said Lyle owed. Have you ever watched someone you love carry debt they were too proud to talk about? Not a suspicion. The weight you could actually see in the way they held themselves, in what they stopped saying at the table. Drop a comment. What did that look like from the outside? Gary folded both papers along their original creases. He put them back in a can. He set the can back on the shelf behind the metric bolts. Then he walked to the house and started breakfast. When Lyle came downstairs at 6, neither of them said a word. They ate in the same silence they'd been building between them for 4 years. Buchanan County sits in northeast Iowa, about 30 miles west of the Mississippi. The soil there is black, not dark brown, black, the kind of soil that takes 1,000 years of prairie grass and glacier to build. In early spring, before the corn went in, you could look at a worked farrow field, and the color was the color of something that had been keeping a promise for a very long time. Cecil Farrow bought his first 60 acres here in 1948. He came home from the Pacific with nothing but his discharge papers and a decision. He wanted something permanent, something that lasted. He added land in 1953, in 1961, in 1967. By the time his son Lyle took over in 1971, the Farrow place was 320 acres, clean record, modest debt, a reputation in the county for being run carefully. Lyle was a good farmer. That needs to be said plainly and early. He wasn't reckless. He understood soil and weather and commodity cycles the way a man understands things when he has given his whole working life to one discipline. In 1979, every agricultural lender in Iowa was saying the same thing. Land is the safest asset you will ever own. The USDA was forecasting global food demand for decades out. The Farm Bureau was holding county meetings where the message was simple: expand now while you can. Lyle listened to the same advice as 12,000 other Iowa farmers. He borrowed $340,000 and bought 160 acres from the Lindqvist family on the east side. $2,125 an acre, the best ground in that corner of the county. Gary was 23 in 1979. He was working the farm alongside Lyle. Had been since high school. He remembered the day Lyle came home from Ames with a note signed. Lyle had been quieter than usual, which was saying something. He set the paperwork on the kitchen table and said, "We've got the Lindqvist ground." That was the whole announcement. Gary's mother, Vivian, had asked if there was anything to worry about. Lyle said no. That was the whole conversation. Vivian died of a cardiac event in the winter of 1982. She was 54, gone without warning. The way people went in those years before the monitoring was reliable. Her death was the first thing that broke the Farrow household open in a way that couldn't be repaired quietly. Gary leaving in April 1981 was the second thing. If your family had a vote right now, keep the farm or sell, would everyone agree? Or would it split something that doesn't heal clean? Leave a comment. I want to know where your family stands on that. Gary had moved to Minneapolis to try agricultural equipment sales, something that used what he knew without requiring him to be here. That hadn't worked. Neither had several things after it. By February 1985, the honest version of why he'd come home was not duty. It was that he'd run out of road. He was 29. His father was 57. They had spoken on the phone 6 times in 4 years. Gary didn't confront his father about the coffee in the first week, or the second. He told himself it was about timing. The more honest reason was that he didn't know what the conversation would cost them, and the farm needed work, and at least the work was something he knew how to do. By March, he'd gone through the filing cabinet. The metal one with the bent lower drawer Lyle had owned since 1973 and never replaced. What he found: 3 years of interest-only payments on the note. Not principal, interest only. The $340,000 balance had barely moved. Iowa corn had been running between $2.40 and $2.70 a bushel in 1984. On 480 acres, Lyle was grossing somewhere between $85,000 and $100,000 a year. Against that, note interest, operating costs, an aging John Deere 4440, property taxes, a household running on one income since Vivian died. Lyle wasn't keeping his head above water. He hadn't been for 2 years. He'd been losing ground slowly, the way a man loses ground when he's too proud to name it, and doing it alone. The Hendersons, 3 miles north, sale pending. The Voss family on the highway, auctioned in October. Ed Krause, who'd farmed 200 acres since 1955, gone by December. Lyle had watched all of it, said nothing at supper. Then a truck came up the drive. Gary was in the barn when he heard it. He came out to see a man he didn't recognize climbing out of a Farm Credit Services pickup, mid-40s, brown jacket, clipboard. The man introduced himself as Dennis Vogel, loan servicing officer, Ames Regional Office. Scheduled collateral walk. He said it the way you say something you've said 40 times in 6 months. Not unkind. Procedural. Gary said his father was in the East Field. Vogel nodded, wrote something on a clipboard. Lyle came back 20 minutes later. Gary watched them talk by the barn, Vogel with the clipboard, Lyle with his hands in his jacket pockets. The way Lyle stood when he wasn't going to give anything away. 10 minutes. Then Vogel got back in the truck and drove out. Lyle watched the truck go, turned and walked to the house without looking at Gary. Did you ever watch a parent carry something that was too heavy and keep their back straight anyway? Not noble, just what they knew how to do. Leave a comment. I want to hear what you remember. Gary stayed in the barn a long time. He looked at the northwest corner shelf. Then he went inside and told his father he'd found the note. Lyle sat down at the kitchen table, didn't say anything, looked at the table surface. After a long time, Lyle said, "I was going to figure it out." Gary said, "When were you going to tell me?" Lyle said, "You weren't here." Neither of them said anything for the rest of the evening. Here is the part that matters most. Lyle Farrow hadn't asked Gary to sign that 1979 note because he didn't want to put that weight on his son. That's it. That's the whole reason. He believed the land values would hold. He believed the note would service itself. He believed Gary would inherit a clean farm with no debt attached to it, And that was the kind of father Lyle wanted to be, one who handed things forward without burdens woven in. He had been wrong about the land values, and the pride that kept him from asking had become, over 6 years, the silence that drove Gary away. Gary found this out not from his father, but from Lloyd Meester, a loan officer at the County Farm Bureau Co-op who'd known both Lyle and Cecil Farrow for 30 years. Lloyd called one Saturday in March. Gary answered. Lloyd said he was sorry about what was happening with the farm credit note. Then Lloyd mentioned, carefully, the cosigner provision. The 1979 note had a clause Lyle had negotiated himself. If a cosigner were added, a second borrower with documented income, Farm Credit would restructure the interest rate down 3/4 of a point and extend the amortization by 5 years. Meaningful savings, a path that had been there the whole time. Lyle had chosen not to use it, not because he didn't know, because he did know, and he had decided Gary shouldn't have to carry it. Gary sat on the kitchen stool after he hung up and thought about that. His father had signed a note in 1979 with a clause that could have helped them, and left it in use to protect his son. He had carried the weight of that decision for 6 years alone. He had watched the market collapse, watched the neighbors go under, watched the interest compound, and kept it all in a coffee can on a shelf. Not because he was hiding it from malice, because he was hiding it from love. The wrong kind. The kind that suffocates the people it tries to protect. Gary had left this farm in 1981 because he had never been invited into the decision that defined his future. He had spent 4 years in Minneapolis angry at a father who, it turned out, had been protecting him the only way he knew how. The reason Gary left and the reason Lyle had been silent were the same thing, seen from opposite ends of the same silence. Lyle Farrow wasn't a loud believer. No verses on the mailbox. No grace said with words, just a pause before meals that meant the same thing. He'd attended St. John's Lutheran in Independence since boyhood. Buried both his parents from that church. Sat in the same pew for 30 years, not out of performance, but maintenance. The way you maintain equipment. Not because something is broken, but because you understand what breaks in the absence of attention. He had stopped going after Vivian's funeral in 1982. Came back in the spring of 1983. The people at St. John's who knew him recognized the gap for what it was and didn't require explained. The morning after Lloyd Meester's phone call, Gary drove the 12 miles to Independence alone. Early service. He sat down 2 rows behind his father's pew. His father was already there. Neither of them acknowledged the other during the service. The pastor was working through the book of Job, not the patience verses. The raw ones, where Job says plainly, I do not understand this. I demand to be heard. The pastor said, God doesn't always explain himself, but he doesn't always require silence from us either. Sometimes the prayer that matters most is, I don't understand this. I'm still here. I'm listening. Lyle sat very still during that. On the drive home, Gary's truck came alongside his father's on the county road. They drove in parallel for a half-mile before the road narrowed. Gary pulled back, a small thing, but through that window, Gary saw his father's face. Not the driveway face, not the hands in pockets face. Something older, more tired, more honest. A man who didn't have an answer yet and had decided to stay in the question. That afternoon, Gary went back to the farm office. He pulled out the 1979 note. He looked at the cosigner provision for a long time. Dennis Vogel came back on April 2nd, this time with a letter. August 15 sale proceeding confirmed. Default conditions listed. 3 consecutive interest shortfalls in 1984. Failure to respond to January restructuring proposal. There was an option, a restructured installment agreement, but it required three things. $41,200 brought current within 60 days. A revised amortization at 1.5 points above market rate. A cosigner review. Vogel explained it at the kitchen table, Lyle at one end, Gary at the other. He said it plainly. The farm's equity position, $430,000 in current land value against $312,000 owed, was enough to support restructuring, if the payment and income requirements could be met. He looked at Gary when he said that, not pointedly, just accurately. After Vogel left, Lyle sat at the table without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not going to ask you to sign for something I broke." Gary said, "You didn't break it. The market broke it. Every farmer in this county is in the same place." Lyle said, "Not every farmer put his whole place up." Gary said, "No, some of them didn't have a place worth putting up." Lyle didn't answer that. The next morning, Gary drove to the Farm Bureau office. He asked Lloyd Meester what it would take to qualify as co-signer. Lloyd said, "A W-2 and a credit review, combined with the farm's documented operating income. Part-time employment would count, paired with the farm income declaration." Gary called a Waterloo equipment dealership that afternoon. Part-time service technician position. Could he start in 2 weeks? The manager said yes. He didn't tell his father that evening. He wasn't ready for what Lyle might say. The $41,200 was the first problem. Gary had $2,600 in a Minneapolis bank account. That was everything. Lyle had $8,400 in the farm operating account. Combined, not close. Gary started making calls. He called his uncle Raymond, his father's brother, who farmed 300 acres in Mitchell County and had spent years openly skeptical of the 1979 expansion. Raymond said he'd been waiting for this call for 5 years. Gary didn't respond to that. He asked for $10,000 against a written repayment structure. Raymond went quiet, then said yes. Gary wrote the terms up and mailed them that week. He called his Aunt Helen, Vivian's sister, Cedar Falls, no farming background. She didn't fully understand the situation, but she loved Lyle. She said she could do $5,000 if it helped. Gary sold the Minneapolis truck, a 1980 F-150 he'd brought back and didn't need. Cedar Falls dealership, $3,800. He drove out to a neighbor, Arlen Dietz, who'd mentioned informal interest in the Farrow hay ground 2 summers ago. Gary put in writing, 80 acres, 4-year lease, $42 an acre annually. Arlen signed it on the hood of his truck. $3,360 a year in guaranteed lease income, and it could go in the restructuring documentation immediately. By the 3rd week of April, Gary had $31,000 assembled, still $10,200 short. On April 24th, Lyle came into the kitchen and set something on the table. A savings passbook, the kind Independence Bank still used for small accounts in the 1980s. Inside, $10,700. Lyle said it was the money he'd been setting aside since 1982. Small money, hog and egg sales, cash he'd kept separate from the operating account in the way a man keeps something separate when he's afraid everything might go. He hadn't spent it during 3 years of interest shortfalls. He'd held it back. He pushed the passbook across to Gary. He said, "That's everything I have." Gary said, "We're $41,000 short." Lyle looked at him. Gary had already said $31,000 assembled. He watched his father do the math. Lyle said, "You've been raising money." Gary said, "Yes, sir." Silence. Then who'd you call? Gary told him, "Raymond, Helen, the truck, the Dietz lease." Lyle sat very still. Then he said, "Raymond's going to hold this over me 20 years. Gary said, "Probably, but he'll hold the land over you longer." Lyle looked at his son then. Not the driveway look, not the kitchen table silence. A direct look, the kind that's past the point where words are the right instrument. They drove to Ames on May 1st, together. Gary signed the co-signer documentation at the Farm Credit Office. Lyle sat beside him. Dennis Vogel processed the restructuring, revised amortization, adjusted rate, co-signer clause active for the life of the note. He stamped the August sale proceeding as withdrawn. They drove home on Highway 20 with the windows down. Good Iowa spring day, the kind that makes you forget how long the winter was. Neither of them said much. The restructured payment schedule was workable, not comfortable. There was no comfortable version of $312,000 in 1985 Iowa, but workable. Gary started at the Waterloo dealership the following Monday. 40 minutes each way on county roads, 5 mornings a week, back at the farm before noon. It wasn't logical. It was the only schedule that fit. The corn went in late, 3rd week of May, 2 weeks behind a wet spring. Lyle said he'd seen worse and still gotten a yield. Gary believed him. The corn came in clean. 142 bushels per acre on average. At $2.55 a bushel on the December elevator contract Gary had locked in August. $87,000 gross across the producing acres. Add the Dietz lease. Add the dealership wages. Add 40 head of hogs Gary had restarted in the back barn in June. Total documented income for 1985, $107,000. After note service, operating costs, and household overhead, $6,200 left in the operating account. $6,200. Not wealth, not comfort, a margin. The first margin the Farrow place had recorded since 1981. In December, a letter came from Farm Credit Services. Not a demand, not a notice, a routine annual account review. The account was current. The restructure amortization was on schedule. Near the bottom, in standard institutional language, a single sentence. Borrower account in satisfactory standing. Lyle read that line twice. Set the letter on the kitchen table. Went to get his coat for evening chores. Gary picked it up after his father was out the door. Read it. Set back down. He thought about October 3rd, 1979. A date he hadn't been present for. A room he hadn't been in. A document his father had signed alone, with a provision in it that could have helped them both, left unused because Lyle hadn't wanted to burden his son. 6 years between that October and this December. A coffee can on a shelf. A son who hadn't come home. A father who hadn't asked. The distance had been almost too wide to cross. It had been crossed, not cleanly, not without cost. Raymond would hold the loan over Lyle exactly as long as Gary had predicted. The farm's equity would take years to rebuild. Gary was now legally tied to a note that wasn't his until he signed it, which meant the next decade of his life was going to be lived in Buchanan County. But the 480 acres was still the Farrow farm. The black soil was still there. And in the northwest corner of the barn, behind the box of Metro bolts that didn't fit anything still running on the Farrow place, a red and yellow coffee can sat on a shelf that neither of them had moved. The thing broken between Lyle and Gary before 1985 was not fixed by co-sign note and a harvest and a current payment status. That's not how those things work. What they had was a working arrangement that had become, through the pressure of that 1 year, something more deliberate than before. A farm partnership in writing. A lease agreement on record. A dealership job Gary kept 2 years past when he needed it. because the structure and the outside distance were useful. Lyle never directly said he was glad Gary had come back. It wasn't in his vocabulary. It wouldn't have sounded like him. What he did was begin slowly, in small ways, to include Gary in decisions before they were made. Not every decision, not with ceremony. The John Deere's major repair in spring of 1986. Lyle asked Gary what he thought before calling the dealership. That had never happened before. Gary understood it for what it was. He stayed. He had told himself in February 1985, driving into Buchanan County with a failed Minneapolis life in the truck bed, that he was staying temporarily. A stop, not a landing. By 1987, he'd stopped telling himself that. By 1989, he'd stopped thinking of it as a question. The Farrow farm carried the restructured note to its full term. Paid off in 1994, 15 years after the signature in October 1979. The land by then was worth around $1,400 an acre. Not the peak, not nothing. Cecil Farrow had bought his first 60 acres in 1948, $180 an acre, built slowly over 20 years. Lyle had borrowed against 480 acres in 1979 and nearly lost everything he'd inherited and expanded. Gary had come home empty-handed and signed his name to something he hadn't created to hold it together. 3 generations. 3 versions of the same bet. Each one imperfect. Each one landed on the same black soil. What the note signed in October 1979 had actually cost was not only 15 years of debt service. It had cost something in the space between a father and a son that never quite rebuilt to its original design. The silence between 1979 and 1985 left its mark the way drought leaves its mark on a tree's growth rings. Invisible from the outside, permanent in the record. But in that same record, Gary Farrow was not asked to sign in 1979. He chose to sign in 1985. That was a different kind of document, not a note against land. A statement about who he was and what, in the end, he was willing to stand behind. He had driven home on Highway 20 with the windows down. The farm was still there. I think about Lyle Farrow a lot. Standing in the driveway in April 1985, hands in his jacket pockets, watching a government truck drive away, not saying anything to Gary, not inviting Gary into that moment, carrying it the way he had always carried things, alone, silently, convinced that this was protection, not understanding that protection and silence had been costing him his son for years before the bank ever showed up. There are a lot of men like Lyle in this country's history. Men who signed notes they couldn't ask for help with. Men who kept things in coffee cans on shelves because there was no way to say it out loud. Men who believed silence was the same as protection, not understanding that the people who loved them were already watching, already carrying a version of the weight, already waiting for an invitation that was never going to come. Gary found a coffee can because he came home, not on purpose, not out of grace, because he'd run out of road. But he came home, and what he found was not a father who had failed. It was a father who had bet everything on a piece of land he loved, lost the bet, and was still standing in the driveway, trying to keep the weight off everyone else. Sometimes love looks like a coffee can on a shelf. Take your time with that before you scroll. If there has ever been something hidden in your family, a document, a number, a decision made alone that shaped everything, I want to hear from you. You don't have to tell me the whole story. Just leave a comment and tell me you know what I'm talking about. That's enough. This is the bank and the barn. The land is still there. We'll be back.